Welcome to the third webinar of our Alternate Eligible Content 2017 Winter-Spring Series. Today's presentation is entitled Alternate Eligible Content and Effective Instructional Delivery. This information will directly connect to last month's webinar, where we talked about instructional planning and the essentialized examples. If you need to access this webinar, to view it initially or as a refresher, please feel free to contact our patent website, www.patent.net, and click on the educational initiative, Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities. There you will find previously recorded webinars. You also find webinars in regard to information regarding alternate eligible content and essentialization. Let's get started. For any content questions or comments during this webinar, please feel free to contact Alternate Assessment at patent.net. Please reference the date of the webinar, 3/22/2017. Any questions and answers received will be posted as an FAQ with the recorded webinar following this presentation. Our focus today is to identify evidence-based instructional practices to use when teaching alternate eligible content. Most will be familiar to you, some may be new, or maybe we will put it in a new light for you. We will also talk about identifying language and vocabulary and concept building instructional practices that will enhance the learning of alternate eligible content, building those into your instruction if you don't already have them. We're also going to be identifying ways to maintain engagement and participation with instruction in a variety of student grouping options. So let's start with defining instructional delivery. So we're all on the same page when we think about instructional delivery. The photo to your left represents a flow and a constant movement when we think about instruction. Instructional delivery is the act of delivering very highly engaged instruction using evidence-based practices. So instructional delivery is more than just providing activities for students to complete. It's really a flow of practices, protocols, procedures that actively engage students with learning, and specifically new learning. It's a provision of a gradual release of I do, we do, you do approach to learning. So it provides the learner numerous opportunities during new learning. And it's a balance of that guided practice and independent practice to solidify learning. And finally, it's an assurance that a plan is in place to support learning of a concept across environments and unique situations. If you remember from all of the work around alternate eligible content, it's written not necessarily as factual knowledge, it is written as conceptual knowledge that we teach a student. We're going to use lots of different pieces of information like literature, informational text, different types of mathematical problems and pieces of learning. But what that really gets to is learning these basic concepts. And we're going to emphasize that over and over again today. But we also want you to think about what we spent our time on last month when we thought and spent time discussing instructional planning. It's really that upfront work that connects to instructional delivery. So all of the considerations that we talked about with planning, for example, that mastery criteria, we write those content targets. You have samples of those in the essentialized examples. But now that you get to the instructional delivery, now we're going to be measuring this. We're going to be measuring to that criteria. We're going to be maximizing the use of our teaching schedule because our planning really ensures that smooth flow to that student engagement and movement through different pieces of release. So our materials and supports that we've gathered, that we have prescribed, or you have prescribed specifically for those kids in your classroom that are going to support you delivering instruction, it's going to support the students accessing this instruction, that all comes together for that delivery to be very smooth. And it also is going to give you an opportunity with that delivery to gather and interpret the data, some of it right in time. So you might be switching gears right on your feet. Others, you're going to look at it and switch the gears as you plan for the next session. All of this has a goal for the students to learn the alternate eligible content, a deeper learning that's not just a rote response, not just a memorized piece of content. It is really taking something and then applying it. So we're going to start first looking at English language arts in our example. So if you remember last month, we used a piece of third grade English language arts, and we're going to follow through with that same example. If you have it from last month, it was handout 1. If you didn't, we included it as a possible download for this month's webinar. So make sure you pull that out. So it gives you a point of reference. While we're not going to be looking specifically at that piece of literature, we are going to be referencing the structure of that example that will, we hope, help you as you think about your instructional practices and your instructional delivery. How to take it from what you're looking at to actually operationalizing that in your classroom. So our evidence-based instructional practices are basically ways to think about hitting that target. They've been shown, there's data research behind them that shows that kids learn when we use these practices. So why would you not want to use something that you know is going to give you that bang for your buck? So you plan on what you're going to use. And always when we start with instruction, you want to tap into the background knowledge. We're going to think about background knowledge in a couple different ways. We need to think about background knowledge and the students' comprehension of language and vocabulary. It's being used in a story. So are we thinking about do they know what we're talking about when I'm reading a story? Or are we just assuming they might know? Or how can we gather some information that really gives us the data that the student knows what it is that we're discussing in this story? So we want to think about that. We also want to think about the student's comprehension of language and vocabulary that's used in the alternate eligible content. So if we're thinking about whether we're using the actual language or a version that we know makes more sense to the student, and we'll describe that in a minute, but we really want to make sure we stay focused on what the student needs to know and be able to do. Because if we can get them to a point of knowing and being able to do what that alternate eligible content is asking that, then we can apply it to lots of different stories. And it's going to greatly enhance the student's ability to understand the world around them, to understand what's going on and what they're hearing, and to make sense of stories and informational text in their life. So this looks familiar. You probably remember this from last month with the instructional planning guide. Again, this is not a document that we're going to ask you to complete and fill in the blanks. It's really a framework for you just to make sure you have all your planning pieces in place. The pieces at the top, the alternate eligible content, the intent statement, all available on that essentialized example. There's also samples of the content, and we said you can just jot right next to that content target some mastery criteria, cross things out, adjust it for your student. No need to fill out anything new. But as you can tell, there is mastery criteria that's been stated, so we kind of have a place we know where we're going. We don't want to get lost. We want to get to where we need to be at the end. And this is how that's going to tell us that. We've outlined our teaching schedule, our teaching materials. And in this case, when we talked last month, we really looked at it in regard to the ReadWorks piece of literature, Attack of the Leftovers. And what we're going to do today for you is show you how you can take another story, and we're just going to reference one that was on our list last week, but we're going to talk about Sheila Rea the Brave today by Kevin Hanks, as another story that's going to get to the same piece of content that the student needs to know and be able to do. And so taking a look at some of the supports we put in place and our data collection that, again, we'll go into more depth next month, but it's part of that whole planning procedure. So let's take this example and let's take a look at Sheila Rea the Brave. Of course, our piece of alternate eligible content is identify characters and what they do during events in the story. So let me tell you a little bit about this story if you're not familiar with it. Sheila Rea is a mouse who boastfully claims she's not afraid of anything. And she likes to show off in front of her friends as acts of bravery, such as she ties Wendell with her skipping rope for snatching it. Also she teases her little sister for being afraid of little things. But one day, Sheila Rea wanders down a strange area, and Louise, her sister, gets the better of her. And, for the first time, Sheila Rea's afraid. But Louise gains the courage and helps Sheila Rea overcome her fear. So this is a story that we're going to use today with this one piece of alternate eligible content, but could be referenced with other pieces. So if you're doing something around theme, if you're doing something around vocabulary, there's lots of different options. You can take all of the materials and supports that you put in with this particular story and then teach other pieces of content and then transfer all of that then to a new story, so you don't want to be doing lots of different work around different pieces of content for different stories, but try to pull it together with one particular story before you move on generalizing that to another. So we said when you start instruction, you want to tap into the background knowledge around the content of the story. So we'll start first with what Sheila Rea the Brave is all about, and it's about, do the students know and understand the concept? Do they even know what a brother or a sister is? They may or may not. So you want to make sure your students understand that. Do they understand the concept of teasing or making fun? Do they understand the concept of family members and how they can support each other? These are just some samples. There may be some other things that you would want to tap into with this book, and you should, but this is just a sample of some things you really want to think about and kind of do some quick assessments around. When you think about the content of the alternate eligible content, do the students know the meaning of characters, regardless of a specific story? So do they know what's meant by what they do during events? Is that something that makes sense to your students, or is it something you're going to have to teach in a different way? Is it something you're going to have to really initially kind of work on with your students' understanding in order for them to make sense of the book, and also in order for them to learn what this alternate eligible content is all about? Do they know the difference between characters and events in a story? Another thing you might want to check into as you start. Again, not all inclusive. There could be other things. You may not need to do all of these, but it's going to be real relative to your students. So when you start instruction, it's very important, language, vocabulary, and concept building. Way back in 2015, we did a webinar, and you can go back and reference it, on language and vocabulary and concept building. It is incredibly important in order for students to make sense of what it is that we're trying to teach them. So we may need to assess and see what they know, what they don't know, so we know what we may need to provide some direct instruction for the student to maximize their learning. So, do students know the meaning of specific language or vocabulary that's used in the alternate eligible content? Sometimes you may need to reduce that vocabulary into something more meaningful for the students, and that is okay. But the first thing you have to think about is character. It's not always a person. It could be an animal, like the case of Sheila Rea the Brave, it's a mouse. Could be an inanimate object. I mean, we have candlesticks who are in Beauty and the Beast. I mean, so a character is really, who that story is about, but who is a very abstract concept for our students. So when we think about what that definition is of characters, it's going to be really important to make sure our students understand that. So in the blue box here on your screen, you're going to see the intent, and that intent is found in your essentialized example. So it's important to keep this in mind, as well as what the student needs to know and do, and we have that outlined on your essentialized example. Remember what you circle and box and underline. So you have to also consider reducing that complexity. So keep looking at your essentialized example as a resource when you think about these pieces. So starting instruction around this word character, we would suggest you might want to use the word character or whatever you're going to substitute for the word character when asking questions, as opposed to making it too abstract, like who's in the story. You could be really specific. What animal is the character in the story? What object is the character? Do students know the meaning of specific language or vocabulary that's used in the story? So you can go through the story yourself. You can pick out words that they may or may not know, and you want to just assess. Brave, afraid, scaredy cat, stepping, sidewalk, crack in the sidewalk. Lots of different the vocabulary that we want to make sure the students understand, so they can understand and make sense of what we're asking them to know and be able to do. So when starting a new story, it's always important to preview the book with the students. There's some predictions you can do, but you can also do a quick assessment while you're doing the preview to kind of assess where the students are in regard to the language, vocabulary, and concept building. So you could provide a short phrase, a picture of the story, like we have up on the screen here, where Sheila Rea stepped on every crack in the sidewalk without fear. Now that came directly from the story, but you can certainly modify that to have it make sense for your student. You could use this page and you could say, for a quick assessment, show me the sidewalk. Show me the cracks in the sidewalk. Show me the character stepping on the crack. Which character is Sheila Rea? Which character? Show me the character who is not Sheila Rea. Only use that if the students understand negatives. Describe what it means to be without fear. Once you have your assessment done, you may need to do some direct instruction around language, vocabulary, and the concept, and you will want to use strategies that we're probably all familiar with: a model prompt test, or on the screen it says model prompt check procedure. It's the same thing. You want to think about your prompt hierarchy, and you probably use that very regularly in your classrooms, but it works very well when you're teaching new learnings, such as the language, vocabulary, and concept building around this alternate eligible content. You want to provide lots of opportunities for students to respond, because this is really going to guide what you're doing. So for example, weak responses, either when the students doesn't respond at all, or they respond and they're looking at you and you don't say anything right away, so they correct it. They may be right eventually, but they're really guessing. So that's pretty much of a weak response. And we want students to have strong, confident, fluent responses. They may make errors. They're not even close. They may have strong responses, and that's when they're correct within 3 to 5 seconds, and they don't self-correct. That means they absolutely know the answer. And the responses can come lots of different ways. It doesn't have to be an oral response. It can be a response with an object. It could be a response with a picture. It could be a response with a device. But either way, a response is a response. And we want students to be fluent, strong responders, which would demonstrate their mastery criteria of knowing the content. So during direct instruction with this language, vocabulary, and concept building, you want to check, provide practice, choices. You'll see in our essentialized example, sometimes we make the discriminations kind of close because we want to make sure that the student understands and is able to demonstrate the learning. Not trying to trick them, but wanting to be very specific. And then once you the student can demonstrate that they understand this language and vocabulary, then you can continue on with the instruction using the story. You can use materials and supports that you gathered during the planning process. And again, collecting data is going to be critical. So now we're moving on. We're moving on into actually getting to the part that the student can identify the character and what they do in the story. So we're still going to use our evidence-based practices and protocols. All of that can stay consistent. And you want to move the student towards the content target, complete with the mastery criteria that you did develop for them in regard to this content. And again, if you need more samples of that, go back to your essentialized example. So the questions that you're going to see are considerations that you probably address when you design or plan your instruction, but you're going to also want to think about them as you start the lesson. How do you introduce what the new learning will be? It's not a secret. We're not necessarily learning the story, so how do you introduce that? How do you maintain engagement and participation? And that can be challenging with some of our students. We're going to talk about some different ways to think about that. And how are you measuring the student's acquisition? So how are you collecting the data? How are you determining what they know before you start? And how do you formally and informally collect that? So introducing the new learning, let's start there. Today we are learning about characters in the story. That could be a sample starter. Because remember, we're planning for generalization. Today we are learning about Sheila Rea the Brave. We can introduce the story in a minute. But we want the students to be embraced with what they're learning, not necessarily just an isolated story. We want them to embrace that concept. We could say today we're learning what characters are doing when things happen in a story. So that's easily transferable to a different story. We're going to do Sheila Rea the Brave. The next story we're going to read is about Charlotte's Web. It's really a cool story. But we're going to learn what the characters are doing when things happen in the story. But then you can then introduce this particular story. After you talk about what they're going to learn, we're going to learn that using this story, Sheila Rea the Brave. So getting into the lesson. You previewed the story with the vocabulary and language. Now it's time to read it. And if you remember, as we've talked all the way along the way with alternate eligible content and the essentialization process, and even on your essentialized examples, it is always suggested that the original text is paired with your reductions in complexity. And we'll talk about what that can look like. So we would also recommend that when you read the story, if possible, students should have a copy of the text or modified text or access to the text somehow, because that's going to help maintain engagement, or access to visuals of the text, access to manipulatives that represent things in the text. Read the original text together. And there's lots of ways to do it. You can do it digitally. You can do it by a human reading it, or you can do it by students reading it. when you think about reducing the complexity, and you don't necessarily have to reduce the complexity of the entire text, you can really look at the pieces where you're trying to hone in on the students understanding this piece of content, which is identifying characters and what they're doing in the story. So you can just kind of lift snippets that need to be reduced in complexity, because reducing the text can reduce that cognitive load and support that learning of the concept for the student. That's really what it's all about. So again, use your essentialized example as a model. We give lots of different examples of how to reduce that complexity. So in the most complex, you're going to modify some portions. Mid-complex, you're going to greatly modify even smaller portions, and up the level of supports. And then least complex are significantly modified distinct portions of the text. And I would really recommend that you go back and look at some of those different examples that we have in each grade. And we're going to continue to add on to those examples. So stay tuned for more information about that. So we've introduced the new learning, and I want to just take a quick second to think about the scheduling, because as I was also in the classroom for so many years, I'd be right about this point saying, okay, wow, that's a lot, Sharon, that's a lot to do. How does that kind of parse out in my classroom tomorrow? So let's think about it this way. We had in our considerations for planning kind of that scheduling. So thinking about what block of time, what absolutely can you devote to instruction around English language arts, alternate eligible content. So we talked about how long and when you could teach this. So let's see what that would look like if we could break it up into those smaller chunks before we go any further. So we had suggested perhaps 2 15-minute sessions based upon students, based upon what might typically be done with kids in 3rd grade. So maybe for that first 15 minutes, you're going to do some of those background knowledge checks of content and concepts. You're going to preview the story. You're going to assess some vocabulary and language, preview pictures, text-to-picture relationships. You're going to preview some of the manipulatives, if that's what the student's using to access the content of the story. You may do some direct instruction about vocabulary, concepts, content, and language. That's probably going to take up your first 15 minutes. Easy. And you may need to adjust that time based upon how you get through that content. Your second 15 minutes, you may have an extension of what you did that first 15 minutes. And that may be all that you get to. And so the next day, you're going to move maybe more into the next, into the story. Or you may be able to move into the story in that second 15 minutes. Or you may be able to do this all as a 30-minute block. It's really going to make sense for you in your classroom. It would be remiss of me to say this is exactly how you have to do it, because it's going to really depend on your kids, and your students the best of anyone. So these are suggestions and samples. You want to really consider your individual students, as well as thinking about maintaining a fast pace of instruction, and we're going to move into that too. So maintaining a nice clip of instruction, and what's going to be a good fit for your classroom. So we talked about introducing the new learning, and now we're going to move into maintaining engagement and participation. So there are some teacher tips and ways to maintain engagement and participation. And so we have to think about how do we make sure that all the students in my group, whether it's a small group, whether it's a large group, maybe I'm doing something with my whole class, maybe I'm doing something with just a small group of my class, maybe I'm only working with a couple students. But how am I going to keep everyone that I'm working with engaged? So there's lots of different ways for group responding. There's lots of different ways for individuals to respond, but it's how do we keep that moving and going. We can use manipulatives, technology. Many of you may have smart boards or other ways to engage your students through technology. You have interactive group activities. What you really want to do is less paper pencil and less independent activities. You want to get your students excited and moving. You can create and make, experience, do some flexible grouping, have them collaborate with each other as possible. If you're fortunate enough to be in a school building where you have students without disabilities and they have an opportunity to come into your room, maybe you can bring them into some of this, which would be exciting for your students, and do some peer assisted learning. So take a minute and read this pink arrow that's on the screen. What I want you to think about is direct instruction always involves active engagement. Engaged learners are learners who maintain and retain their learning. This next slide really was an aha moment for me. Another way to think about active engagement is group alertness. I want you to think for a minute about defining alert in measurable terms for the students in your classroom. It's probably going to look different for different kids. So take a second. I want you to think about that. Consider what it looks like for your students when they are alert and engaged. For some kids, it may be that their eyes are open. For some kids, they've got the facial expressions going, or their bodies are moving. For some kids, they're just talking away. What does that look like? So now that you kind of have a picture in your head of what it looks like for them to be alert, what can you do to increase the amount of time that the students in your group are alerted to the instruction you're providing? What are you doing to capture the attention of all of those students? Think about a lesson that you did either earlier in the day today, or in the past week, or with either a small group or a larger group of kids. Were they continuously focused and alert to your delivery of instruction? Here are some ways to think about active engagement and some group alertness. Okay, instead of telling students information, always giving it to them. So the teacher involves his or her students at every turn. So students can have copies of the story with modified versions, appropriate visual tactile supports. They might have the information available on their AAC device. We have students maybe using whiteboards or holding up signs or things that are going to help them interact. Maybe they're acting something out. Maybe they're acting out brave, or they're showing you afraid. Do a little drama, or showing each other. That would be fun. Maybe there's a question and the teacher, what's the character doing? And instead of the teacher telling the students, they work together to figure it out. And then, or search for a picture or search for a clue that's going to tell you the answer. And the teacher can then work on their debriefing, and if they need to be corrected and use some Earless learning, we can do that as well. So maintain your engagement and participation. Think about pacing and student responding. So pacing means limit the downtime, maintain a fast pace. So teacher, you're the lead connect with your students. That means you're actively interacting with them and actively kind of guiding their interaction. Provide more learning opportunities. Sometimes I used to always, in my classroom, I used to call it over planning. I'd rather have too much that I could use at another time than not enough, so that my students were constantly interacting in some way with the materials, with the content. Limiting downtime, this is not news. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. We know that reduces problem behavior and off-task behavior. Frequent student responding is going to increase their alertness. There's lots of active engagement. They don't know when they're going to get called on. They're going to be part of what's happening. They're just not listening to someone else interacting. And it provides kids a lot more practice. I'm sure you've heard the terms errorless learning and effective error correction, but they can really help you with pace, and they can help move things along. So if the student incorrectly responds, immediately give them the correct answer. Immediately have them repeat that correct answer, whether it's even using a manipulative or, you want to immediately do that. And then you go on to another student, come back to them and at a very quick pace. It helps you to break down information into smaller units, and it allows for formative assessment. It helps you see what the students are learning so that you can adjust right on the spot. Error correction is immediately. Again, if the student makes an error, you immediately correct it and have the student repeat it and move forward. If the student's not responding in errorless learning, give them the answer and move them forward. So here's some examples of pacing, and I can talk you through. These are real classrooms with real kids, real teachers in our state. And this is actually a special educator in front of a large group in an inclusive setting. Informational text, 3rd grade. And the teacher was using a very quick pace, using errorless learning and error correction. And the kids didn't even have to raise their hands. They didn't know when they were going to get called on, because he was moving very quickly in response to this content. He had worked with a smaller group of students on that vocabulary prior to that instruction. And here he's using a strategy using choral responding. He had been getting some individual responses, but he shifted. And what he's doing, his hands raised as he's asking the question. And when he drops his hands, the students have practiced and they know that's when they need to respond to that question he just asked. It helps to keep a pace moving, and it helps the students to stay engaged with the instruction. This was, again, in an inclusive setting, 3rd grade teacher working on vocabulary around Charlotte's Web. The teacher was using a very animated pace, moving quickly through students, providing the correct answer when a student hesitated, engaging students with and without disabilities. And I can assuredly tell you, in all of these settings, there were students who were taking the PASA. So also note that students have materials in front of them. They can also use those for responding. So there are lots of different ways the teacher was using to engage students. In that smaller group setting, there was lots of errorless learning and error correction. The students were only allowed a few seconds to respond, and the teacher eagerly was moving on to make sure that they got the correct answer or corrected them when they erred, and immediately moved forward with the next question for the next student, coming back to that first student to make sure that they responded fluently. So there is a pace to it, and there is a way that did maintain engagement and participation. Lots of different ways. You can see in both those photos there were materials that were also available for the students to respond, and they were moved around and shifted. I like this little cartoon, which really says it all, that after weeks of instruction, Susie learned that cup meets anything in the top right corner. And we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that our quick pace and our errorless learning and error correction lead students to really attending to what they're being asked and really attending to providing an answer that's going to lead to learning towards that mastery criteria. So another way for maintaining engagement and participation is using formative assessment. So back to our story, Sheila Rea the Brave. We want you to think about informally assessing, in addition to that summative assessment, but informally assessing the student. So if you remember in the beginning of the story, we did teach vocabulary and language, and we used the word brave and afraid were two words. And that is a theme that kind of goes through this story. And since this concept is throughout, we want to make sure that the students understand these representations. So in this particular case, the students understood a superhero as brave, representing brave, and selected this picture for afraid. You could also have these as objects for the students to be able to use as response mechanisms. So after reading portions of the story, we reread and asked the question, is Sheila Rea brave or afraid? And we would match language to language that's familiar to the student. We can also think about, rephrasing the question. So the student could select the card that reflected their answer, and that's going to give you information. It's going to give the student information. You could also follow up with another way to ask the question that might work better for your students. Show me the character that was brave, and they would have choices. In a summative assessment, when we're really getting to a question that directly reflects back to the intent of the alternate eligible content, we could say, show me some things that Sheila Rea is doing. Now, there's a couple correct answers here, because remember, our alternate eligible content says, asked what the character is doing in the story, is doing during an event in the story. And of course, we have some choices here. And we know they're not just going to select things that they see in the story, because we particularly put playing baseball when that's not indeed happening, though they do have a baseball bat in one of the pictures. So we want to check for comprehension, and that informs the student. And what the student's learning, it also informs the teacher. Maybe I need to go back and reteach some things. We also want you to see that we based this example on our alternate eligible content, that essentialized example that is part of your packet, and you can see where you have the question example, different ways to ask what the character was doing in the story. And so we just based this upon what is provided there as a framework or a reference sample. So you would need to generalize this. And different ways we can think about it is we can think about it across stories, and they're listed in our plan. And so we want to teach that same character and what they're doing in the event. You would want the student to be able to do this across people. They could read the story with others and identify characters and what they're doing. So different teachers, different paraprofessionals, parents. Can they do it across places, at home, at school, in the waiting room, in the library, outside, at a desk, on the floor? Can they do it across different delivery types? It's a book, on different devices, on a computer, as a comic book. So they're all things to think about when you think about generalizing this piece of content. So in our remaining time, we're going to apply what we just learned through our math example, which is our handout 2 from last month and also for this month. So again, we want to hit the target using practices and protocols that we know will result in learning. So we're going to use that same lens or frame of reference. So we're going to look at the alternate eligible content as well as what's being used to represent or describe the problem. So there are two different ways to evaluate how you structure your lesson. So how do you open the session? By tapping in the background knowledge. Are you evaluating the student's comprehension of interpreting data? Are you evaluating the student's comprehension of language and vocabulary being used in the alternate eligible content? Here's a sample math lesson planning guide that uses the example we visited last month, which was answering questions using a two-way table. Notice the mastery criteria and content target have been established during the planning. Materials and supports, as well as the teaching schedule, is established. Not that it can't be adjusted as you teach, but it's been established to at least give you a starting spot. And we reviewed these last month, so now it's time to operationalize. So looking at your example that you, if you've printed that out or you printed it out last time, what we're going to do is the essentialized example can help us gather ideas and samples in regard to reducing the complexity of what the student really needs to know and do around answering a question using data from a two-way table. Remember, the samples, the examples are provided in Word and PDF, so that allows you to manipulate it and not have to reinvent the resources. So for today, we are using a type of two-way table provided, but we're going to change the amounts reported, and we're going to think about something that might be more relevant for the student, something that might make more sense. Remember, it is the mathematical concept that you're teaching, not the size of the amounts used or specific content. So use the context that makes sense for the students. Use amounts, because what we're teaching is, can they answer a question using data from a two-way table? Okay? So tap into background knowledge around the data. Do they understand concept of data? Again, not inclusive questions, but it's background knowledge that you need. What's their experience with data? What's familiar? Does the content in the essentialized example make sense? So I think we had data around bake sale. Well, in this case, perhaps the class is already, this 8th grade class is having a book share. And so they've been bringing in books, and they've been learning in their ELA about informational text and storybooks or literature. So that's what we're going to use. So it's relevant to the class. But you can use whatever makes sense for your class. So then, what about the alternate eligible content? Do they know about two-way tables? Do they know about columns and rows? How do they answer questions? How can questions be presented? So we have our intent statement there. So we really just need to use some of the summary data combining two characteristics to answer questions. So can they go across and up and down and come to a middle? Again, the amounts are irrelevant. Use what's familiar to your students to teach this concept. So let's think about language and vocabulary that we want to use. Do they know what a story is, what books are, share, class, two-way table, data, column, row, a total? Important things for students to know and be able to do if they're going to read this table and read it accurately and answer questions about it. Use a quick assessment. Very similar to what we did in ELA, a short phrase. Show me class 1. Or find class 2. Find information book. Find storybook. Find the book that is not information. So only use negatives if that's understood for the student. But it's going to give you information about what they know or don't know and what you may need to kind of pre-teach as you're working towards this content. Show me a column. Show me a row. Find across. Find up and down. Use language that's familiar to your students. Explicitly teach the concept and vocabulary using a model prompt check procedure, model prompt test. Provide prompts for at least to most procedure, fade to independent responding. After you assess, teach what's not known. Think about your responses. We talked about those before. What are weak responses, so the students are self-correcting? What are errors? They're not even close, or they're not responding at all. Strong responses, that means they're right there within 3 to 5 seconds. Use your materials and supports that you gathered during the planning process. Collect your data in regard to language and vocabulary acquisition. Provide practice and choices to ensure the student can demonstrate understanding of the language and vocabulary before continuing with instruction around reading this two-way table. So once that's been assessed and instructed, now you can really start moving towards the context and content and start moving towards hitting the targets in regard to this alternate eligible content. So plan what you're going to use. How do you introduce new learning? Do you remember what we talked about with the ELA? We're not necessarily teaching about the book share. What are we teaching? That's right, we're teaching about two-way tables and reading two-way tables. And we want the students to be able to generalize that to other two-way tables. How do you maintain engagement and participation? How are your students, are they alerted into what you're teaching? Are they maintaining an active alertness? How are you measuring their acquisition of the new learning? Informally, formally, and how are you moving towards those content targets and the criteria you've selected? So introducing the new learning. Well, this is what you were thinking. You're absolutely correct. These are ways to start this lesson. Today we're learning how to answer questions about data, or you could say about information, on a two-way table or on this special table. Notice we're planning for generalization. We're not teaching about book shares. We're not teaching about bake sales, but we're teaching about how to read this table. Today we're going to learn to find information in rows and columns of a two-way table. We're going to use information from our class book share. So now I've connected it to something relevant for the students. Use something relevant with your class. And then start out, just like previewing the book, you're going to review the two-way table in its entirety. You're going to use direct instruction to assess answering questions about this two-way table. You can reduce the complexity, use your essentialized example to help you think about it. Remember, the most complex content, you're going to typically just use digits. You're probably just going to use words. You may also have some visuals to help the students understand the words, but you're really going to be having the students interpret those symbols or those digits. Mid-complex, we're moving more into pairing digits with quantitative amounts. And again, folks, your students can be proficient at any of these levels and still be able to demonstrate that they're able to answer a question about this two-way table. And then least complex, we're only going to be using quantitative amounts and representations. We can use manipulatives in a gridded table for students. Think about your scheduling considerations. In our sample lesson, we had one 30-minute session where we kind of divided it up into 15-20 minutes of direct instruction with guided practice, and then 10 more minutes of practice with some feedback using a variety of tables. But this is how you could break it out. Remember, we talked about what could this look like tomorrow in my classroom, Sharon. So this is kind of some ideas. And again, it's going to depend on your students. So you want to assess vocabulary. You want to have your materials and supports available. Use some direct instruction to what the students, where you assessed and it showed that they didn't know. And you want to teach to mastery. You want to start teaching your target after you've done some of this preliminary around the vocabulary and the content. You're going to plan for generalization, use different tables, use different quantitative amounts, represent it differently. And again, you could break this into 2 15-minute sessions as well, depending on your students. Teacher tips are going to be the same. You're going to want to be doing the same kinds of ways to get your students engaged. You're going to want to have fast-paced instruction. You're going to want students not just doing worksheets, their seats. You want actively moving students. Make a grid on your floor. Have the students actively in the grid. You can have students, you want them frequently responding. You want to use errorless learning, increase practice of correct skills. Really make sure you're using effective error correction that's immediate and gets right to the pattern of errors at in the responses. Fix those immediately for your students. And then think about that generalization. How are you going to move students through generalizing, answering questions using a two-way table? So are they able to go across and down? And they're not just memorizing the one table. So you want to use different tables. So here's a table about folks who are wearing yellow or not wearing yellow and whether they have blue eyes or they don't have blue eyes. Could be a little complicated. You have some larger digits in there. Here's hair color, boys and girls. Oh, here's one about jeans. That might be appropriate in 8th grade. You want to make sure your content and context is appropriate for the age level of students that you're working with. And this is an 8th grade piece of content. So you want to be respectful of students who are in 8th grade and what would be important to them. You want to also think about different people. Can they read this two-way table and answer questions with different people within different school settings and at home? Can they read tables in school, in different places within the school, in different seating areas? Can they do it at home? Can they do it by looking at a table on a computer? Can they do it by looking at a table on a smartboard or on a worksheet? Can they read the table that's on the back of the electric bill? You want to make sure that it's applicable and that the students can transfer that skill across different tables that look differently and that are represented in different ways with different people. That's mastery. So that was our whirlwind tour with instructional delivery. We talked about and identified some evidence-based instructional practices that are best to be used when teaching alternate eligible content. And I am sure most of you are using many of these evidence-based practices. We hope we put them in a framework that makes sense when you think about that with alternate eligible content. We really emphasize the importance of language and vocabulary and concept building around the alternate eligible content, because that's going to enhance the learning of when you put it all together, so that we know students and can prove that students are able to understand this language. And we also talked about ways to maintain engagement, active alertness of your students, and participation of instruction. Thinking outside the box to get kids excited about learning and engaged with learning. Please join us in April when we look at data collection and decision making around alternate eligible content and using these essentialized examples and what that can look like and what some samples can look like for use in your classroom. And then in May, we're going to be looking at some essentialized examples for writing and for science, so be sure to join us. We would love to have you as part of our listserv and as part of opportunities for volunteer work in regard to alternate eligible content. So sign up on our patent website. Under students with significant cognitive disabilities, there's a listserv volunteer tab that you can click on and provide some information that will help us get you on board. Contact information is on the screen. Please feel free to contact any of us with specific questions. And thank you so much for joining us today.